Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you, featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today, a former actor and a grade school teacher, now a parent education specialist, teacher trainer, and public speaker, James Encinas, uses his creative skills and experiential workshops to instruct participants about the impact of trauma on childhood development. Now, there's so much more that you have in your story, James, but I think it's very important to start with this. So you were a teacher, and now you're a parent education specialist. Why did you change? Because teaching is so important.
Yeah, it's a good question, Susan. I didn't really choose to leave the classroom. That choice was kind of made for me in that at some point towards the latter part of my work as a teacher, I taught for 17 years, and I'd say the last 10, I started becoming active in the community. Our union rep had left the school, and no one wanted to take the position, and then everyone seemed to think I was the person to do it. So I became the rep at the school, and that kind of got me very involved in a sense, as an activist to try to support the teachers and the community that I was representing, predominantly African American and Latino.
Right.
And that work, at one point, the school came under. There's a Proposition 39 in California, which allows charter schools to take over empty space, and the population was starting to dwindle, and space was opening up, and I bought a co-location by a charter school program called Green Dot, and eventually won that, and they weren't allowed to locate in our school, but the man who actually created Green Dot, Steve Barr, at some point he and I came together, and he actually offered me a job, which is, I guess, a long answer to your question.
Right. In
terms of that job, I took a leave. I worked for Finn Schools, which was Barr's organization on ed reform, and that led me to, at some point, being appointed an Aspen Fellow, which is now the Aspen Pahara Fellowship. And that changed my life.
I hear you.
So I hope that answers
I think
why I left the classroom.
I'll tell you something, James. I know a lot of people send their kids to charter schools, but I really would love your opinion about how that affects kids. Are charter schools the way to go, or how do you feel about them kind of invading, if you will, different areas and kind of having people who would ordinarily send their kids to public schools? What's your opinion about that? Because it is a controversial subject.
I think this might be too simplistic. I don't really, I don't have an issue with charter schools, and whether they're better or worse than public schools. What I feel that I have many friends that are running charter schools, and I think it really comes down to the culture that's created in that school and the people's commitment to enhancing the lives of children and providing them with an effective education. So, you can go across the board, and there's terrible charter schools, there's terrible public schools, but there's also amazing public and charter schools that are doing great things. And so I think one of the things that our fellowship, we were the Teachers Leader Fellowship at Aspen, it brought us together with charter and people like Union, people like myself, and people that are working in both worlds, and the hope was that we would come into some form of agreement, and we did.
Yeah.
But really, it comes down to the quality
How do we rate,
and
James?
the well-being of the children.
Yeah. How do we rate when you look at the kinds of schools we have in the education that we're providing? How do we rate between, say, Canada or Europe or the Orient, any place like that? Because I've been told that there's so much quality schools in various places in the world, and we're not doing as good as we should. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, I mean, in terms of on a larger demographic, I think there's some amazing schools in this country, and there's some amazing teachers and principals and leaders in education. And we are compared, like Finland is a model that is compared against, and they do a great job. But I think education is not and has never been as supported as it needs to be.
Yeah.
Susan, I think, and that's a shame because our kids are our future, right?
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing some of the issues that are coming about because of a lack of emphasis. I mean, every president comes out and champions education, but I don't think there's really an investment, and that would be a whole show in and of itself.
You're right, and I really would love for you to talk about that in another show, because I'll tell you something. When you look at the schools and you think about the people who are involved in the schools and all the different people that have an opportunity to learn and to take away so many different ways to kind of create a great life for themselves, and suddenly, you look at it and you say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why is people shooting in schools? Why is there all the different things that are going on? But, we'll talk about that another time. But now I just want our audience to understand a little bit about the Aspen Institute Teacher Leaders. Now, you mentioned that it was a community of global leadership, and it gave everybody an opportunity to come and talk and do all the things that are necessary to plan. So tell our audience a little bit more about the Aspen Institute.
Well, so 20 of us were chosen, I think, out of 600 applicants, and just amazing people and who become lifelong friends. And I think it's set up in a way that comes about because we come into relationship with each other, and we go through trust exercises and spend a lot of time talking about creating the good society. And I just recently had a conversation with one of my fellows, Carrie, who's up in Minnesota, and she has the Avalon School, Carrie Backen, and she's an amazing woman, and she's doing amazing work. I think there was one final thing I wanted to say in terms of the education conversation.
Right.
I think it needs to be holistic. I specifically in terms of the work that I'm doing, social emotional skills are just as important as academic skills. And I think that's not something that we have focused on, and why some of these kids are struggling, because we're dealing with, and I know we'll get into this conversation, but you never know what the homes that children are coming from,
right? And
the things that they're dealing with, and that's become my whole mission in a sense, is to develop. It's all about relationships, Susan. I mean, that's what I've come to understand.
Right.
We're relational beings, and that's how we interact. That's what we need, and so I give me another question in terms of Aspen.
Well, the Aspen Institute, as far as I know, has been a really fantastic organization of global leadership. Now, when
Yes.
you talk about global leadership, define that for our audience.
Well, I mean, in terms of my experience, is what we come together to do is to look at the great leaders that have gone through time, the great thinkers, the philosophers, the academics, the leaders of countries, and people who have worked on making this a better world, and we look at it from the perspective of how does one create the good society?
Yeah.
What does that take? And we read and have conversations on text, and then we bring our own personal thoughts and insights into it. I would say that for me, and you read my book, I grew up in a world where both of my parents were highly educated, and education, going to college was never a question, but there were a lot of things going on in the home that prevented me from actually sitting in a classroom and paying attention to a lesson. So I struggled, and the amazing thing that happened, and again, going back to relationship, is I was sitting in a room of incredibly accomplished individuals who'd gone to Harvard and Princeton and the top schools in the country and had a wealth of academic knowledge. And I struggled, but they held me.
Yeah.
They loved me and they supported me. And what I had was I had emotional intelligence. I had needed to develop that in order to survive.
Before you go on to James, because I think you just hit something on the head, and that is emotional intelligence. That's a very interesting expression because there's a gentleman, and I wish I remembered his name, maybe you do, who realized that if kids sort of would walk through a different kind of forest, say a forest, and they recognized a little tiny spider or they recognized a rock that looked very interesting to them, they would study it. And that's my idea of emotional intelligence, where you just look at everything in life. You look at nature, you look at the environment, and you can find things that you never thought you could find before. Is that what you think about emotional intelligence?
There's many different levels of emotional intelligence. There's heart intelligence. There's intuition, as you're talking about. There's wonder. It's using the right part of your brain, the creative part of your brain, to engage, and not the left brain is logic, right? It's
right.
Understanding. It's cognitive knowledge, and the right brain is where we explore other ways of engaging. And I think what they're both really important, but some of us aren't able to develop both to the extent that we can effectively use both. And so I think that's the important thing for me in terms of Aspen, is when I left Aspen, because of what I had experienced and because of the academic life career that the learning that I've experienced, I wasn't an academic. I didn't have that base of knowledge that these people brought into the room. But when I left Aspen, that part of myself was, a light went off. The understanding that knowledge was important, that knowledge was power.
Yes.
And also that it could give me the things that I needed, because there were two pieces that I read in Aspen. One was Walking Away from Omelas, which I talk about in the book, written by Ursula Le Guin. It's a fictional piece, and it's about this little girl, this place of beauty, and everything is perfect, and every day is beautiful, and there's this little girl in a basement, and everybody knows she's there, but nobody does anything about it because they know that if anybody did, that whole town would change.
Wow.
It would no longer be what it was. And so the conversation became about those who walk away. It's those who walk away from homelessness is the title of the piece. And I started thinking in terms of my own personal life experience that I couldn't walk away, that I needed to acquire the tools to come back and help that little girl.
Yeah.
And that's been my work ever since. Is we have a responsibility to our communities, to our children, to everybody's well-being. So
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your book. First of all, give our audience the names of your books and tell them where they can get them first.
So the title of the book that's out now is called Wheeling to Healing, Broken Heart on a Bicycle, Understanding and Healing Adverse Childhood Experiences. And they can get it on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
It's available at Amazon. It's available at the bookstores, Borders. And it's also available through the publisher. And I'm kind of blanking right now, but New 72 Publishing. That's www.new72publishing.com. And New 72 Media is the
I'm glad you told our audience about how to get your book, because it's a fascinating book. I mean, I spent, so much time reading it and trying to think about you particularly. Now, let's talk a little bit about you for the moment, because we really have been concentrating on, what you've done recently. So now you're from Bolivia, and you came to this country when you were 8 years old. And there must have been something that affected you, because you are a unique person in many ways. So how did it feel to come to another country when you're a young kid?
There's a lot of, it's scary, right, to be displaced and to be taken to a whole different world, really. And it's also full of wonder, and I come from a world that was full of wonder for me as a child, in terms of that world of magical realism that exists in Latin America, where we come from an indigenous people, and there's a lot of mysticism, there's a lot of connection to the earth, and I had the opportunity. I think 80% of brain comes online by the age of 5, and so I had an opportunity to really take that in and just be enriched by that experience. And at the same time, there were a lot of horrible things going on at home that kind of shut parts of myself down. But I think when my parents would get into major fights, my mother would leave him, my father, and we would go to my grandparents, her parents, and that to me was a magical place. They live in a town called Sucre, which is the capital of Bolivia, and it's the white city, because there's like I don't know how many churches. There's like churches in every couple blocks, and it's all bathed in white, and my grandmother would take me across the street to the church, and I described that in the book. It was exciting at the same time that it was scary. The saints and the images and the tears of blood, and it just was so it was a very rich, complex experience that has definitely informed me. And then I came here, and once I got here, it took me a long time to find a sense of belonging to a place.
Right.
I was taken away from my home, and I really didn't feel like I belonged here. In fact, I ended up in Irish-Italian communities.
Right.
And until I was 18, I thought I was Irish or Italian.
That's fine. That's very funny. Just yesterday I was talking about a movie called The Jerk. I don't know if you remember Steve Martin.
Oh, yeah. Steve Martin, right.
And right. Steve Martin, he looks at himself in the mirror because he's been raised by African-American people, and he said to himself, I'm not African-American? Oh, my God. So in your particular case, I'm sure you looked in the mirror and you realized that you were a Bolivian, but you know what? The situation made you kind of take a look at the life a little bit at age 8, and that's fantastic because when you look at life and you see all the different things that are there that are opportunities for you to grow up and be a special person, that's one of the things about America, isn't it? That you have the freedom to be who you want to be. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that would be another piece of emotional intelligence, awareness, like being aware of your environment, being aware of the differences and the nuances, because you have to be, right? Your system, that fight or flight part of yourself, the primal brain, is really wired to survive, and so you're just much more attuned to what's going on around you. And I will say, I mean, especially with the things that we're going through now and the issues that we're having with race,
right?
It wasn't on many levels. It wasn't a pleasant experience in terms of kids can be really cruel, and so not knowing what to make of me, right? In terms of they've never seen someone like me, a dark-skinned person, especially in the communities that I grew up in. I was the only Latino in those schools, and so the names. I mean, they didn't even. I didn't even know what chink meant. That used to be a derogatory word, and it was only because I had in my eyes. Our eyes are in our indigenous communities. Our eyes are small and or spick, and So I went through a lot of that on top of what was going on at home, and then going into classrooms trying to blend in,
right,
and sticking out like a sore thumb, but so much needing to want to be part of that community. So that was a struggle in terms of.
James, here's another thing that I'm sort of interested in, because when I was young, I went to a school, and Puerto Rico was a kind of protectorate, or became part of our U.S. in many ways, and so we had a lot of kids from Puerto Rico in our classes, and most of them didn't even speak English, but they learned English right away. They had, from what I can see, they had a desire to really learn and to be, kind of part of the community. And that was a long time ago, I want to let you know. But I think today things are changing, and people are staying together in their little group.
Allow people to, our cultures are rich and varied, and they have much to provide us. So that's a whole conversation that's been had, especially in the education community and in different states.
Yes.
As to whether people should learn English and follow the culture that's been presented to them. I think technology has its pros and its cons, right? I recently, someone posted something on Facebook, and it's a picture of a little boy with a tackle box and his fishing rod, and that we needed. The comment was that we needed more of that, and I think we do.
Yes.
I think on some level, the negative aspect of technology is taking away from our sense of creativity and imagination, because these children are growing up disconnected, and I don't know what that's going to lead to. I think on many levels it's probably going to lead to a much less compassionate, empathetic society, because we need to connect with each other. We need to connect to nature. We need to connect to our surroundings in order to be human.
To be human is a good thing. In the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, there was an article, and it said that your best friend is going to be a robot. Can you imagine that?
Mm.
I mean, what does that say for our world when your best friend is going to be a robot? People say, well, things are great because the computer can do so much for you, can, do things that you never would imagine are possible. But again, interestingly enough, what you're telling the world is that there's a lot of work that we have to do. You can combine technology and you can combine humanity. And this is something that we have to think about. And we need people like you to say things like just what you said to me, that there's a problem and it needs to be rectified. Now, let me just go to the last question, which is, you see yourself as an ACE or ACE's ambassador. What does that mean?
When I left Aspen at the end of it, I realized that I needed to pick up tools, and I started reading voraciously. Neuroscientists like Bruce Perry. He's written a number of books. One of them was Born for Love, Dan Siegel, and others, and trying to understand why people do what they do. And ACEs, apart from giving my life context, it just spoke to me on so many levels. It was a study. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and it was a collaboration between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. Dr. Vince Folletti was in San Diego working with obesity, and there was a large attrition rate, and at one point he ran into a patient. I think at the time she was known as Patient X. I actually was just at a function with Dr. Folletti in Phoenix, I guess about a month ago, where I found out her name was actually Mary. Mm-hmm. But Mary had dropped, I think, from 400 some pounds down to 139. And Dr. Folletti didn't use surgical procedures. He put them on a stringent diet, and they lost tremendous amount of weight.
Yeah.
And when he ran into Mary, I think in a 3-week span, she had put on 30 pounds, which is unheard of. And when he started asking her what happened, he found that at work, well, initially what she identified was that at work, some man, because he now found her desirable, propositioned her, and that triggered her, and she started eating again. And that led to other questions in which he went deeper into Mary's history, and I think at some point asked her when she had her first sexual experience.
Really?
And it was 4. She was sexually abused by her father. And so what that uncovered was that what we saw as the problem was actually Mary's solution.
Now, how do you account for that? I have to understand a little bit more. How could somebody who's been put into that situation, and it's such a horrendous one, how do they what do they do? How do they think? How do their families think? And, is there some way for them to get rid of all the anxiety and all the depression that probably sets in?
Well, so the reason that this was such an awakening for me is he presented his assessments because many of the women that were in the program had been sexually abused, and the numbers were astounding to him. And so he presented that at a conference, and all the other doctors kind of laughed at him. But there was a Dr. Robert Anda, who at the time was the head of the Center for Disease Control, and they did a much larger study, 17,000 some people, and they looked at the different factors of adversity in childhood. They looked at divorce, living with an alcoholic parent, living with a member who's depressed, being sexually abused, living through domestic violence. And what they found was that the more you had of these factors in your life, the more you were apt to use unhealthy coping skills in order to survive that. The levels of addiction were increased, the levels of mental illness, the levels of violence from individuals increased. And because what we regard as normal experiences, even like divorce or living with an alcoholic, they cause most of our chronic disease, mental illness, and violence. So in answer to your question, I think one of the things we need to do, and one of the things that this study has helped us to realize, is that much of this that is occurring in our communities is protected by shame and secrecy and social taboos. We don't talk about these things. We don't talk about what happens in our lives. But, from reading my book, I talk about growing up in domestic violence. I talk about how that impacted my development.
Yes.
And I interviewed 42 other people, and they talked to me about being sexually abused, about growing up with an alcoholic father who was neglectful. And what I think that does is it takes it out of the shadows.
Yes.
And that's really, in a sense, I want to pull these experiences out of the shadows, these experiences of abuse, because only then will we be able to answer the question that you just asked me in terms of what does a person do? Because what I do know is that what they do on many levels is live a tragic life.
Yeah. Because
they are broken, right? But the beauty of it is, and the reason I do this is, there's an amazing guy who I met through Aspen, Brian Stevenson, and he's just a force.
I hear you.
Do you know him?
No, unfortunately I don't, but just listening to you talk about him, makes me want to know him.
He's a social justice advocate. He's the director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He's written a number of books, and just a beautiful man. But, and he's an incredible speaker. And at one of the functions that I was able to witness him, he talked about that the broken, that there is a power in brokenness, that it is the broken that can teach us what it means to accept God's grace. It's the broken that can show us the power of mercy. It's the broken that will teach us what compassion can do.
Yes.
And I feel like, the things that I have experienced have made me who I am.
Yeah.
At the same time, I was fortunate, and this is the really important piece in all this, is actually Buckminster Fuller says it, much better than I ever will, is you can, if you want to change people's minds, give up.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
but
it's true. It's really true, because so many people try to change their partner's way of doing things, and there are so many people who think, well, I'm going to get married to this particular person, and I'm going to change them, because I don't like what the way they look or the way they think. Okay, and so it's really important to share all this information with our audience, because if you don't, who will? So
and the second part of that, Susan, the important part of that is give a person a tool, and over time, it will change their perspective.
I hear you.
So in answer to your question is, people who have those experiences, like that woman who's sexually abused, she needs to heal. She needs to be given the tools to make choices that are not self-destructive, that don't continue that cycle for her.
I hear you.
And the simplicity of that is, in terms of your audience and in terms of the people that we're reaching, is it's not complicated. It really isn't.
Yeah.
It really comes down to, and I think people like kind of hear this word, and it comes down to love.
Oh,
it
what
comes
a
down
wonderful
to,
word that is, love. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it comes down to, I'm in my second year of seminary, and I have to read a lot of texts, and I recently in one of the books there was a story. The book is about how can we help in our work and in our ministry, and the story was about this social worker who what she did was she would get people to the right services. And she did it day in and day out. And then a woman walked into her life who she connected with, a homeless woman who was on top of it, had a lot of other things such as addictions. And for some reason, she decided to personally take her through these systems. And it frustrated the hell out of her because every place she would put her, whether it was in a home, it wasn't successful. She wasn't able to adapt to these supposed, fixes or ways of being that were supposed to be better for her. And at the end of the piece, and this is the important piece that connects to the love piece, is this woman started getting sick, and it was clearly evident that she wasn't going to be around much more. But the relationship had turned into love. She cared about this woman.
Isn't that something?
And so she one day finds her after another one of these failed placements in the park, and it's raining, and she's sitting under a tree, and she's so frustrated because she got her a warm bed to sleep in, but she didn't want to be there, right? And so she says, I don't know what else to do, and I'm sorry I couldn't help you. And she knows in that moment that she might never see her again.
Right.
And she says goodbye, and she gets on a bus. And as she's driving away, something stops her. Yeah. And it makes her come back. And she then does this simple thing. She sits down next to her in the rain.
Wow.
And she stays with her.
Isn't that something?
It's not that complex, Susan. I really don't think it's yeah.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you. James, I'll tell you something. I'm going to explain one last thing before we have to go, but here's what happened to me, and I'm going to share this with you and my audience. I had a relative who was a drug addict, and he tried and he wanted to kind of be part of the family again because he left, and unfortunately he was very sick as a result of the drugs. But I said to him one of these days, why don't you come with us? Why don't you be with us? Share, we're your family, and we love you, even though you have your problems, and we would love to be able to help you, but, just be with us. Well, he came, and at the end of the quote-unquote, I'm not going to call it a meeting, but at the end of the day, he said to me, I'm sorry. He said, I want to be a cousin to all of you, but my life is different than anybody's life, and I can't be in your life. I can't be. Now, you just said something different, and maybe what we should have done, instead of preaching to him, don't do drugs, don't do this, is we should have said to him, well, we love you very much, and we want you to be healthy, and we want you to, get whatever you want, okay, and to live a long life. Well, the moral of the story, James, is that we haven't seen him in many, many, many years, and we don't even know how to reach him. So I love the statement you made. All you have to do is turn around, look at the person, even though they may be strange, may have mental illness or whatever. Just give them a little time and sit with them and relax with them and, show them that you really care. So, James, you're a fabulous person because I read your book and it's inspiring. Now, I want my audience to know, James wrote Wheeling to Healing, Broken Heart on a Bicycle, Understanding and Healing from Adverse Childhood Experiences, a book and a curriculum. So, thank you so very, very much, James, for being on the Susan Brender Show, and we'd love to have you back. And you could tell us more stories because you've got some wonderful ones. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you for listening to The Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.